We only remember the stallions that made a big impact or had influence in our industry. The other ones, maybe in a fleeting moment, maybe they were good show horses, and we remember them because of that. But the ones that we really key in on are the ones that had a major influence in our industry.
There are more exceptional cutting horses in the show pen today than ever before. They're more flashy, more athletic, and each have their own style. However, nearly every one of these cutting horses can be traced back to the same origin. Tell me those foundation horses that are responsible for the horses that we see today entering the show pen.
You've got King, P234, you've got 3 Bars, and you've got Leo.
3 Bars, Leo, and King.
These horses were around during the 1940s, right?
King was.
Okay.
3 Bars was probably 1950, and then Leo would have been back in the 40s, right?
So to clarify, King P234, what was it about King that made him such a special sire?
King P234 produced race horses in the 40s, early 50s, and so they loved that. That's when the Quarter Horse Registry was just being founded, and so he was one of the top sires right there off the bat. And then he also had Royal King, he had Poco Bueno, and just every cutting horse out here has some King P234 blood in him, at least 80% of them do.
What about the individual that was responsible for Doc Bar? What about 3 Bars?
3 Bars brought together a mix of the thoroughbred influence, hybrid vigor, and extremely good conformation.
He's probably the most important horse, I think, if I had to pick any of them, him and King. Those two right there. He was a good racehorse. Wasn't a top flight racehorse, but he was a good racehorse. But you crossed him on the King bred mares, the Poco Buenos, the Poco Tibios, and it was just a dynamic cross.
What about Leo?
Leo brought many things to our industry. Conformation. He sired horses that looked better than he did, actually. Athletic ability. More than anything else, trainability. He was really a good, well-minded horse that accepted training extremely well.
Leo was a racehorse, and of course, I love the thoroughbreds in our quarter horse industry. I mean, they just add some strength to it, and they're pretty horses, long neck. You just can't get them too big for our guy. So the Leos were racehorses to start with, and then they came with the Leo Sands, which would be Peppy Sands, Mr. San Peppy, Little Peppy. That set of horses right there, and they produced very, very well.
The 3 Bars Leo cross was magic back in the day, 50-some years ago.
Leo mares on
3 Bars, or 3 Bars mares on Leo studs.
You mentioned the name that most everybody knows, Doc Bar. Can you tell me how he revolutionized the cutting horse industry?
Doc Bar actually revolutionized the cutting horse industry more by mistake than on purpose.
And why Doc Bar produced so well, we don't know.
Well, it kind of happened by accident, right? From what I hear.
Yeah, he was a halter horse. He was a racehorse, supposed to be to start with.
Yeah.
Tom Finley raised him out there in Chandler, Arizona.
Tom Finley, who was a very close friend of mine and a mentor of sorts, a past president of AQHA, raised the horse. Ultimately, he ended up in the hands of the Jensen family, and Charlie Ward was their son-in-law. Charlie was training cutting horses, and the Jensens decided to cross their cowbred mares on Doc Bar. Actually, they tried before that, the Finley ranches tried to get Doc Bar to run, and he wasn't fast enough to even, I think, get A time. Back then we had A, AA, and AAA time. He wasn't fast enough to scare anybody, but he was athletic, and he was a very sensible horse. Had a lot of conformation, and what he did is he brought the 3 Bars influence into our cutting horse, and so I talked about hybrid vigor and the ability for 3 Bars to infused our breed with that quality. It just went right through his veins and into Doc Bar's through Lightning Bar. We were exposed to something brand new, an outcross stallion.
I think he changed everything. Back in the days when we had the King and the Hollywood Golds and the Raydale Ranchos, they were good cow horses, but they didn't move like the Doc Bar horses do. And it's from the 3 Bars influence. 3 Bars, Lightning Bars to Doc Bar. And of course, the 3 Bars were great race horses, great halter horses. Big phenomenal there too.
Doc Bar had a knack for siring some really athletic, trainable individuals that had a lot of spark along with it, and captured everyone's attention. And they had an unusual way of working a cow, had a lot of flutter. I use the term get jiggy with it. Doc Bar's got jiggy with it.
Before the 70s, probably 60s, 70s, a lot of stallions were more cold-blooded. They're real cowy, but, lacked a little bit of momentum or juice. We had 3 Bars, who's a great horse, great stud, great cowy horse, had a little bit of speed, so it kind of set the bar a little higher for our colts, made them a little bit more athletic. So that athleticism with the cow horse sense really kind of raised the bar, I think. But when Doc Bar showed up and we started breeding to those Doc Bar stallions that were great, and there's, a plethora of them, they were all great. What they introduced to me was that juice, where now you couple the cowiness of a horse with that juice, a little bit more hot, maybe a little easier to train. They just took it to a new level. So I think you look at all those great Doc Bar stallions, and of course, without Pocolina and Teresa Tibio, you wouldn't have had any of them. So there were great mares involved, bred to Doc Bar that produced Docalina and Dry Doc, Smart Little Lena. Some of the great horses that you could track back to Doc Bar real close were phenomenal athletes in themselves, and then they produced just like them.
When Fizzabar came along,
okay,
she was a daughter, the first really good cutter.
I see.
And when she came along, and she was out with Pocativio mare and by Doc Bar, and when they saw this, they said, "Whoa, this is something special." And so then everybody jumped on the Doc Bar bandwagon, but it was really on the King bred mares, the Pocativios, the Pocahueno mares that made the whole deal work. But I don't think there's a horse today in the fraternity, if you can find one, you bring it to me, that doesn't have Doc Bar in his bloodlines.
What were some other studs around the same time Doc Bar was in his prime that you would say had an effect or an impact on the horses we see today?
Horses that really had a big effect along with Doc Bar at that time were Pepe San, Mr. San Pepe, and then a little later on, Pepe San Badger, or we refer to him as Little Pepe. So they showed during the 60s and the 70s, and then they started siring foals that really made a big impact towards the early 70s and on through the middle 80s. Smart Little Lena, who had a big impact and still does through his daughters today in our cutting horse industry, was a great example of that magic cross we've been talking about. He was by Docalina, who's by Doc Bar, and he's out of a daughter of Pepe San, who's out of a daughter of Royal King. And Royal King was by King. So you see, we had a great influence on all those sires we talked about.
What were some of those horses in the 70s, 80s, 90s that played a role in the evolution of the cutting horse?
When we think back with the horses, like Little Pepe was such a phenomenon and such a great horse. He raised the bar. And I think that's probably when I remember horses like Lynx Melody, or with Larry Reeder, or, Bill Freeman on Smart Little Lena, Tom Lyons on Duck's Oak. They go hand in hand. I remember the rider, the trainer, and the horse. But I think that they set the bar. They just eke it up just a little bit every time they, that year, when you watch any one of those horses I just mentioned compete, it is, they're like one of a kind in their circle. The cutting was never over unless one of those great horses had already worked.
There have been many pivotal moments throughout the cutting horse evolution, one of the most notable being when Highbrow Cat came along. He's still the all-time leading cutting horse sire, with offspring earning more than $88 million, and the sire of 8 NCHA Futurity champions, such as Metallic Cat, Highbrow CD, and Highbrow Super Cat, just to name a few.
What was it that Metallic Cat did in the show pen that you wish all of your other horses could do?
The thing that made Metallic Cat so special in the show pen is he was so smart. That was a quality of his daddy, Highbrow Cat. I mean, he sired a lot of smart horses. A lot of people rode a lot of good cats. And Metallic Cat he had a way of being able to cut some cows that, your competition really wasn't looking at. They were fast cows. They weren't very good, and he just wouldn't miss those cows. I mean, he just had a hold of them, and he didn't threaten them. He drew them to him, so he never took himself out of the cutting. He made every finals we went to. He never lost a cow, and he was always in contention to be right up there in the top holes at every show. So that was just, brilliant.
Smooth as a Cat, to me, is probably the most consistent horse I've had, and I think that was his strength. Obviously, he was talented. He had a good look on a cow, super smart, but he just, that horse just didn't make mistakes. You felt like every time you went down there, I felt like I was going to mark a 74 or better. He just gave you that kind of confidence because he was just, he's just that smart, that consistent, time after time after time.
In the show pen, Dual Reyes was probably the most explosive horse I've ever ridden. Just everything that he did was so powerful. He was so intense. He did things that he didn't have to do, but it made him unique.
In my opinion, Once in Blue Boon, just his brilliance on a cow, like his intelligence. He's the only horse I've ever rode that could be going with the cow one direction and change directions mid-stride up in the air and go the other direction. I just wish more horses were as intelligent on a cow and thought about working a cow like he did.
Tag was just so willing. He wanted to work a cow, wanted to hold a cow, and just seemed really willing to please. That's what seemed to set him apart to me.
The one thing Smooth Talking Style did in the show pen that I wished most of my horses would do all the time is when a cow got tough, he bared down even harder.
So grit, mentality, like
Had
cow smart?
A lot of grit, a lot of try, stopped and moved well. And, when the cow would get after him, he'd draw his knife.
Bama Jelly is a show horse. He had every tool that a good horse needs as far as being smart, athletic, all the things that a horse needs to be, but he probably is one of the purest horses I've ever had. He's never had a lack of effort, and I think that's probably the thing I like about him the best. It's just that he gives you everything he's got every time.
In the show pen, Bad Boon Horizon was always real willing to please. And he really felt like he had my best interest. He wouldn't let me override him for the cow, you know what I mean? And if the cow got to doing something and I was doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, he would override me for the both of us best interests. He was always real sensitive and cautious, and he had a huge motor but he was real contained about it. So there was a lot of speed in the show pen that he had to offer, but he was always just cautious and soft about it at the same time.
So, former owner of Metallic Cat, current owner of Stevie Ray Vaughan, both Futurity winners. How important is it to you that those stallions, to be a promotable stallion, win early in their career?
Huge, huge. It's another thing that I go off of. I'll look at stallions, how did they perform young in life, okay? Like 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. Because I believe, and there may not be any science to this, but I believe that they have a better chance of passing that on to their offspring. And that's where all the money's at. The money's in the 3-year-old, 4-year-old year. So I key on that. I do key on that.
What are some of the young studs, in your opinion, if you had to pick 3, that are going to be the leaders going forward, that are going to carry on the evolution of improving the cutting horse?
I really think Dual Reyes is going to really help change the business in a good way going forward. I'm really impressed by the hashtags that I've seen. I really like them. I haven't gotten to ride any, but just watching them through the 2-year-old sales, their conformation in the sales, yearlings, babies, whatever, they have a look to them. And I really believe in Metallic Ray Mink. I think he's just a phenomenal cow horse. I was lucky enough to get to help Gary through that horse's career, and he had next level intelligence about a cow, and none of it was manufactured. He was just a pure cow horse, and he was just very special.
The new generation, first it was Smart Little Lena, then it's Highbrow Cat, then it's Metallic Cat. And I think a lot of your Metallic Cat sons is the next generation. I still think there is a need for a outside the box kind of go-to to break that Highbrow Cat up. Whether you want to look at hashtags, you want to look at Stevie Ray Vaughan, I think you can pick your flavor.
I read it, I think it was an AQHA journal I was reading. It said the fame of a stallion directly corresponds to the ability of his offspring to excel in the arena.
Sure. If his offspring start winning, his name comes back alive. If he was, say the stud had kind of drifted away, but an offspring comes out and spanks him at Fort Worth, and all of a sudden that stallion's name reappears. So
yeah,
you bet. There's a lot of that.
What has changed most about the stallions that we see today versus those horses from yesteryear?
Well, I want to give a little credit to yesteryear because every horse we've got here, bloodlines from yesteryear. Okay, so we've just streamlined them so much. They're quicker, they're faster, they're smarter, and we're breeding like in the old days we'd breed Dock Bar to a Pocattivio mare that never won any money, maybe never been ridden. Just a nice $1,500 mare. And now we're breeding mares that have won $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 to studs that have won the futurity, and they won $300,000 or $400,000. And you're just getting a better individual, or you're getting a prettier horse.
People tend to forget now is that how different it was as far as cattle available. Cattle were a lot more domestic, not bred with hybrid vigor that we see today. They were big, pretty keeper heifers. Most of the cattle we cut on are steers, a lot of Hereford, Black Angus influence before they were crossed with other cattle. So those cattle were a lot softer, and they didn't demand the athletic ability that is demanded today in cutting. And we had a lot fewer shows. So those horses competed in maybe 5 big shows a year, and now the stallions of today in the last decade are competing in maybe, 20 to 50 shows a year. So those are just some of the variables that people don't really take into consideration when they try to compare apples to apples, or really comparing apples to oranges because of the difference in those variants.
Do you think those horses that we just spoke about, if we were to put them in the show pen today, could they compete with the horses that we have around?
The ones by Dock Bar could. Somebody asked me one time, they said, what horse would you pick if you had to bring a stud back? Well, I'd say I'll take Dock Bar. He produced Doc Lena, Doc Stoke, all the fraternity champions, dry dock, I'd take the old horse and cross him on some mares that won a lot of money, and then you got her made.
The question that comes to my mind is, could the horses of yesteryear, those horses in the 70s, 80s, could they compete if they were to enter the show pen today?
You got to, again, compare apples to apples. And the older show horses that we've mentioned, like the great Little Peppy, like Mr. Sam Peppy, like Docalina, like Dry Dock, Royal King, Sugar Vaquero, all these great competitors that I can remember, and I'm not mentioning half of what I want to recall. But if you had them today as a 2-year-old, and the way that we train horses today, on the cattle that we train today, you have to remember, back then we didn't have a flag, and we didn't have mechanical cows. We just, trained them on cows, real cows. So there's a lot of differences. But I think if you put those horses in the programs of today with the great young hands that we have today, trainers, I think they would compete very, very, very well, if not dominate just like they did back then.
Makes sense. So tell me if I'm wrong, but like in the 80s, at that time you had to think, man, these horses are really cool. These are really good horses. This is the best we've ever seen. And then the 90s come along and they get a little bit better. And then the 2000s come along, they're a little bit better. So my question now is, we're in 2022. In your opinion, how do you make these equine athletes better? Where do you see the evolution going from here?
If it can get any better is, our breeding. It always comes back to breeding. You have to have to me, a great mare and nick it with a great stallion so they complement each other. And I think that smart breeders have done that, whether they're mare owners or stallion owners. When you start training horses now, it's so, I don't want to say it's scientific, because I still believe it's an art form, but I think, as the 2-year-old program is really important. But even before the 2-year-old program, before anybody steps on them, the health, the condition, all that, when these babies are born and they're yearlings, they're like projected to be a superstar, every one of them, when they hit the ground. So you treat them as such. You let them still be a horse. That's the best to me. But you sure try to take care of them, and your feeding program is better, is stronger, so they develop good bones and the conformation that you want them to have, so that they're going to be able to take the training, because it's just the nature of the beast. It's tough. To match a cow's wits and match a cow's athletic ability these days requires a lot, both mentally and physically. So going forward, I think we just keep improving on the breeding, and breed to the best cross you possibly can, and put it in a good program that's going to develop that horse to be the superstar that you want.
It's all about breeding, Every year we breed, we try to breed to where it's better. And so that's the whole purpose of the genetics, is let's try to make that better. Let's try to make that better. Wow, they're so good right now. And these horses are phenomenal, what we're seeing. But you know what? In the 70s, they said the same thing. They said the same thing with those horses. How could it get any better? And look at us today. These horses today are just leaps and bounds above. Nothing against the foundation stallions. They were their time. They were the kings. But as breeding evolves, as genetics evolves, as all that evolves, we get where we're at today. And I have to say it's going to get better. I just got to go with history and how genetics evolved, that I don't know how we don't just keep getting better and better and better.